In this section of the course, we'll learn about Redshift materials, textures, and nodes. In this video, we start talking about Redshift material, which is the Uber material in Redshift, and it will take us a few lessons to learn about all of its aspects. The scene is fairly simple. We have this shader ball, this backdrop geometry, and a few dome lights to light the scene. Each of these dome lights have a different HDRI. So if I start IPR, by simply turning on any of these dome lights, a different HDRI map will be used for the lighting. Now, this is a good point here. For look dev purposes, test your shaders and materials under different lighting scenarios with different HDRI maps. If the shader holds up under all of them, you got yourself a good material. For now, we'll use the first dome light. In the Material Manager, go to the Create menu, Redshift, Materials, add a new Redshift material, and this is your go-to Redshift material to create almost everything. Let's also assign it to the shader ball geometry and double click on it to open up its shader graph. Redshift material has different components or layers. It has a diffuse or a base layer, a reflection and a coating layer, a refraction or transmission, and also subsurface and multi-subsurface, sheen, self-illumination, and bunch of others. In this lesson, we take a look at the diffuse component of the material, but before that, the shader comes with a few handy presets. Let's take a look at them. We have glass, plastic, copper, gold, platinum, and so on. These presets could be a good starting point. For now, let's use the plastic preset, which returns the material back to its default state. Now let's take a look at the diffuse component of the material. Here we have three parameters: diffuse color, diffuse weight, and diffuse roughness. Diffuse color is the base color of your material. A more scientific explanation is that the diffuse color sets the base color of the material and how bright the surface is when lit directly with a white light source. Now, if I set the diffuse color to a pure black color, the shader now does not have any base or diffuse contribution, and the same thing would happen if we set the diffuse weight to 0 and used another color other than black for the diffuse color. Now, if I set the reflection weight to 0 as well, we get a completely black surface that absorbs all the incoming lights. Now, let's use a nice diffuse color. Diffuse weight controls the weight of the diffuse contribution to the entire shader. So if set to 0, the diffuse component does not contribute to the overall shader, and at 1, it contributes fully. We can use a texture to control the diffuse color. To add a texture to your shader graph, from the Nodes panel, open up the Textures category, find the texture node, and drag it to the work area. And now load this parquet texture and connect it to the diffuse color input of the material. Now this texture controls the diffuse color of the shader. For now, let's disconnect this texture by clicking on the connection. As a rule of thumb, never use 100% white or black colors as your diffuse color, especially if you are not in the ACES workflow. The whitest I normally go is an RGB value of around 230, 235, and the darkest is something like 25 to 50, 60. Those absolutely black and white colors exist rarely in nature, so keeping your base or diffuse color in a realistic range is a must. Even if you are making like a snow material, which is very white, you don't need to use a diffuse color higher than 240, and for a white wall, that value can be simply less than 200, and so on. Even though ACES gives you more flexibility in higher ranges and allows you to use brighter values without a considerable penalty, but you still should try to keep this range in mind. For now, let's try a nice diffuse color again. Diffuse roughness controls how rough or smooth the surface is. For a surface like plastic, you need to use a lower value, and for a surface like sand or concrete, you would need a higher diffuse roughness. So that is about the diffuse component of the Redshift material. We take a look at this backlighting translucency parameters in the next video. See you there. In this video, we'll learn about the backlighting or translucency attributes of the Redshift material under the diffuse parameters. Let's create a new Redshift material and assign it to this plane geometry. If I start IPR, we have a simple spherical light behind our plane object, and you notice the material won't allow the light behind it to shine through. Now let's open up the material and see what we can do about that. This backlighting or translucency section allows you to simulate thin, translucent surfaces that allow light rays to go through them. As soon as we start increasing the translucency weight, the light rays start to shine through the material. Now remember to use this translucency backlighting effect only with thin objects like paper or leaves. If your geometry has some thickness, you need to use the subsurface scattering attributes of the material, which we will talk about them later on. This translucency option here is a cheap and old way to simulate subsurface scattering for thin surfaces. If I change my diffuse color to a mid-blue color, and start increasing the translucency weight, you notice that blue color does not show up as the light rays are allowed to shine through, and instead this translucency color, which is a mid-gray color, shows up. If I change that color to a red color, now we start to see that color. And if I turn on my third dome light in the scene, now, if I set the translucency weight to 0, we see our blue diffuse color, and as we increase the translucency weight, that defined red translucency color will start to show up on the backside of the surface. Now, let's look at a real-world example. Let me hide the plane, unhide this plant, and turn off the dome light so we are left with our sphere light. If I open up the leaf shader that is being applied to our leaves, you notice here I have set the translucency weight to 1 and define this leaf texture as my translucency color. The same leaf texture controls the diffuse color as well, and this texture going through a color correction node before being connected to our diffuse color and translucency color inputs. If I zero out the translucency weight, as we don't allow the light rays to shine through our leaves, we get a very unnatural look. As soon as we start increasing the translucency weight, therefore allowing light rays to go through the leaves, we get a much more realistic result. If I turn on my third dome light again and play around with the translucency weight, we realize how much having translucency adds to the overall realism of thin surfaces like papers, lampshades, leaves, and so on. For a final quick render, let's turn off the sphere light and keep the dome light on and see what we get here. Okay, so in this lesson, we learned about the backlighting translucency section of the Redshift material. See you in the next video. In this video, we'll learn about the reflection component of the Redshift material. Start IPR. We already have this material assigned to the shader ball, so open it up to get started. Let's use a dark diffuse color with the RGB values of 40 to see the reflection contribution a bit better. Normally, reflections are more visible on darker surfaces. The reflection section of the Redshift material allows you to define and control the overall reflectivity of your shader and surface. Reflection weight controls the amount of reflections on the surface. Decreasing this value makes the reflections less visible, and increasing it would have the opposite effect. Basically, it influences the brightness of the specular highlights. Reflection color here controls the color of the specular reflection, and you should keep this color at white or grayscale values for non-metal surfaces. But for metallic surfaces, you can use any other color to get colored reflections. In more modern PBR workflows and in trying to make the shader as physically accurate as possible, I tend to keep the reflection color at white for almost every single shader, for plastic, wood, concrete, ceramic, and everything in between. Unless you are creating a metallic shader, you leave the reflection color at white and use the reflection roughness and the IR value to customize your reflections. Keep that in mind. There is a lesson in this section called How to Shaders where I show you the simplified approach to realistic shader creation. Do check that out to see how that works. For now, let's move on. We can use a texture to control reflection weight or color. We need a texture node to load textures. Instead of looking for a texture node in the node panel like we did in the previous lessons, I'm going to press Shift C. Now we can search for a texture node and press Enter to add it to the work area and load this BW21 texture. And connect it to the reflection weight. Also, because we are in ACES and this texture controls a data input, which is a reflection weight, as we learned, we need to change the color space to raw. Now, this is a black and white texture, and you see where the map is white or 1, we get a reflective surface, and where the map is black, we get only the diffuse color without reflection. If you want to see the texture on the surface instead of the material itself, you can connect the output of your texture to the surface input of the output node instead of your Redshift material that is currently connected to that input. This output node determines what will show up on the surface. For example, we can have 10 Redshift materials in the work area, but only the one that is connected to the surface input of the output node will be visible on the surface. For now, let's connect our material again. For most of my shaders, I tend to leave the reflection weight and color to 1 and white, respectively, as it is both easier and more accurate to add variations to the reflections using the roughness and maybe the IR value. We talk about this more in that how to lesson. For now, let's disconnect the image and delete it and make sure reflection weight is 1 and color is white. Then we have roughness, which controls how sharp or rough the specular reflections will be. As I decrease this value, we get sharp, mirror-like reflections, and as I increase it, we get rougher and blurrier reflections. This is the single most important parameter in the Redshift material, hands down. The key to realism is reflection roughness and how good you can add variations to it. Let's load this texture called BW38 in a texture node. And connect it to the surface input of the output node so we can see it on our geometry. This texture is mostly white, and the roughness value, if you remember, goes from 0 or black, which gives you sharp reflections, to 1 or white, which gives you rough reflections. This texture is mostly white with some dark patches. So if we connect this texture to the reflection roughness, we should get a very rough reflections with some sharp patches here and there. Let's connect this texture to the reflection roughness input of the material and connect the material to the output node again. And this is what we get. Very rough reflections with some sharper patches here and there. You can modify these texture values in terms of darkness and brightness to control the roughness. So let's make this image to go through a scalar ramp node before connecting it to the reflection roughness. So add a scalar ramp node, and this node basically gives you a curve or a ramp to manipulate the incoming data. So connect the texture to the scalar ramp node and use the scalar ramp node as the reflection roughness input for the material itself. And for now, let's set the scalar ramp node as the output shader as well. The left point controls the dark values of the texture. So if I increase the Y value for this point, those dark patches become brighter and brighter. Let's set it to 0 for now. And the right point controls the brightest values of the texture. So if I make its Y value lower and lower, the brighter part of the texture will become darker and darker. In this case, I want to completely invert the image. So let's do that. And now because the texture is much darker with some white patches, if we take a look at our material again, we should get much sharper reflections with some rougher patches. And that is the results we get. Very cool. So if there is one parameter that you need to spend most of your time on it, it should be reflection roughness. Try to make sure it is as best as you can get it, because adding those variations and imperfections to reflection roughness makes your material more real to the human eyes. For now, let's disconnect the texture and use a simple value of around 0.1 for the roughness so we can discuss the rest of the parameters. The next parameter is IOR, or index of refraction. For shaders that are not transmissive or refractive like glass or water, this parameter controls Fresnel reflectivity, but for transmissive surfaces, it will control both the Fresnel reflectivity and index of refraction. Now, what is Fresnel? Fresnel effect or law states that the strength of reflections on a surface is dependent on the viewing angle. The reflection increases as the viewer's angle of incidence. That means in real world, the faces that are parallel to the camera or to the eyes are less reflective, and as the faces become more perpendicular to the viewing direction, they become more and more reflective. And at the incidence angle to the viewing direction, almost every single surface will become 100% reflective. IOR value controls this effect. The lower the value, the stronger this effect is, and vice versa. If I set the IOR to something low like 1.1, normally IOR value starts from 1 for vacuum and then you go upward. Now we get a very strong Fresnel reflectivity because the parallel faces are almost non-reflective, and as the face is becoming more perpendicular, they also become more and more reflective. Now if I gradually with 0.1 increments increase the IOR value to 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, 1.6, we are making the Fresnel effect less effective, which means the reflection strength will be more even on the parallel and perpendicular faces to the viewing direction, which means the reflection strength will be more even on the parallel and perpendicular faces to the viewing direction. For most daily materials like plastic, wood, concrete, and so on, you can use IOR values between 1.5 to 1.7. For water, it's something like 1.33. For glass is 1.52. And if we keep increasing the IOR value to something like 5, 10, 20, 30, we start to see a metal-like surface. That is because the Fresnel effect at these higher values will become so weak or non-existent that the reflection amount on the parallel faces will even out with the reflection strength on the perpendicular faces. And that is one way to create metal shaders. In this case, you can use the reflection color to determine the type of the metal. For example, I can use a pale yellow to create a gold shader. For now, let's change the reflection color to white and IR amount to 1.5. There is actually a better way to create metallic shaders using Redshift material. You can change the Fresnel type from IOR to metalness. When you do that, you notice reflection color and weight will be grayed out, as we don't need them when using metalness. In this metalness mode, first make sure metalness is set to 1. When metalness is set to 1, to control the color of the metal, you can use the diffuse or base color and this reflectivity color down here. Diffuse or base color controls the color of the metal surface for the parallel faces to the viewing direction, and the reflectivity color controls the color of the edge tint or the color of the perpendicular faces to the viewing direction. For example, for a pure chrome material, I can change my diffuse and reflectivity color to maybe an off-white with the RGB values of around 235. And we can use the same color for the reflectivity color as well. For a gold shader, we can use a light yellow color as the diffuse color and a less saturated, brighter version of the same color for the reflectivity color. If you wanted something more like copper, you would use a more orangish, brownish color, and again, a less saturated version of the same color for the reflectivity color. You can still use the basically roughness value to control the sharpness of your metallic surface. And obviously this metalness value, you can connect your metalness map if you have exported from 3D texturing apps like Substance Painter. You would connect that map to this metalness input. For now, set the diffuse color to an off-white with the RGB values of around 220. Use the same color for reflectivity, metalness to 1, and reflection roughness to 0.2. Now, anisotropy controls how directional the specular highlights should be. By default, it is set to 0, which means isotropic and the reflections are not directional. As I go to positive or negative values, you can see how the highlights are stretching and becoming more directional. Anisotropy rotation changes the orientation of the anisotropic reflections, and as I change this value, I am basically rotating my stretched out highlights. Obviously, you can assign textures to both anisotropy and rotation and create some cool effects. In this case, let's load this radial anisotropy texture. Set it as the output shader just to see how it sits on the surface. Increase its scale to about 2 and 2. And now connect it to the anisotropy rotation input. And set the material as the output shader again. And now we get these complex specular reflections. You don't have to necessarily use the anisotropy and anisotropy rotation in these obvious ways. In combination with specular roughness, these two can be used to achieve subtle but really realistic surface variations, which is a bit more beyond the introductory purposes of this course. Check out MoGraph Plus YouTube channel. I'll be trying to talk about that in a separate video there. Let's take a look at this BRDF dropdown. Here we have a few BRDF types to choose from. You normally use Beckman or GGX. These two are basically physically accurate reflections and highlight models. It's really not about which one looks better or worse. It's about which model represents the real world better. GGX has a white specular tail representation as it's seen on polished metals. And as I go between Beckman and GGX, you can notice that on their own, GGX could be maybe a bit more realistic for like metallic surfaces, but as we have a coating layer which can be used as a second reflection layer, you can combine Beckman and that coating layer to get a better and more customized specular tail. That's a bit more advanced. Ultimately, it depends on what you want and what you think gives you a better representation of what you are trying to create. We also have two other Fresnel types, IR Advanced and Color Plus Edge Tint, which I will skip them to avoid confusion, and as they are barely used, you can check out the Redshift docs for them instead of me here wasting your time. So that's about the reflection section of the Redshift material. See you in the next one. In this video, we'll learn about the refraction section of the Redshift material. For this lesson, we got this bottle and glass geometries. Later on, we'll use these gem objects as well. I'm going to create a new Redshift material. Assign it to the bottle, the glass, and the gems. Open up the material and start IPR. Refraction or transmission weight controls how much transmissive or refractive you want the shader to be. At 0, you have no refraction and only diffuse color and reflections. And as I increase it, we start adding more and more refractive or transmissive quality to the surface. At 1, we have a fully refractive surface and the diffuse color and weight will be ignored. That is because Redshift material follows energy conservation law. This refraction section in conjunction with its subsurface subsection makes it possible to create not only simple refractive materials like glass or water, but it also allows you to simulate more complex shaders like honey, caramel, chocolate, and so on that in addition to refractive properties also have subsurface scattering attributes. We talk about that later on. For now, let's learn how to work with these main refraction parameters. Then we have refraction color, which can be considered a multiplier to the refraction weight. If I start using darker colors, we start losing some of that refractive quality and the diffuse portion of the shader will start to show up, and at black we get no refraction at all, like when the weight was 0. Let's get back to white for now. We can use any other color to get a colored glass if we wanted, maybe green, blue, or any other color that we want here. In this case, I'm going to use a pale blue color with the RGB values of 179, 227, and 255. And this will result in a uniform sort of fake coloration of the refraction component of the shader. For now, let's change the color to white. Instead, we can use this transmittance color and absorption scale down here to create a colored glass shader that considers the shape and thickness of the geometry. Naturally, colored glass has different shades of a color based on its thickness. Thinner parts will be tinted lighter and thicker parts will have darker shades of that color. Transmittance color controls the color of the light rays after it has been absorbed by the material. Let's use an unsaturated greenish blue color with the RGB values of 173, 255, and 241. Nothing happened. That is because this absorption scale value is very low. Let's try something like 0.3 or 0.2 for now. This absorption scale controls the strength of the absorption. When absorption is low, light will travel further through before it is attenuated, while at lower values that absorption is barely happening, so that defined transmittance color, which in this case is this greenish blue, is not visible. And as I start increasing the absorption scale, we start to get a more solid, darker appearance. Let's try 0.2, which gives us this realistic looking colored glass. For now, let's reset our transmittance color and scale to their default values. We talk about this subsurface section later on. Let's get back to the main refraction section of the material. To control how sharp or rough the refractive surface is, you would use the reflection roughness, which by default controls both reflection and refraction roughness. Right now, it's set to 0, so we get this sharp glass. To get it to be frostier and rougher, you can increase the reflection roughness. And to make it sharper and less blurry, decrease the value. And in that case, you would get sharper reflections as well as refractions. If for any reason you want to have rougher or sharper refractions compared to the reflections, or basically have separate control over your refraction roughness, you can uncheck this link to reflection checkbox. Now you can increase or decrease the refraction roughness parameter independently from the reflection roughness. But normally you want both the reflection and refractions to have the same roughness. It's a handy option to have. For now, let's have link to reflections enabled. Now let's quickly create some nice frosty pattern on our glasses. I'm going to add a texture node and load this floral pattern. And connect it to a scalar ramp, so we can control its values later on like we did in the previous lesson. Now use the scalar ramp as the output shader. As our geometries don't have proper UVs, we can use a triplanar node. So let's add one and put it between the texture and the scalar ramp. I'm going to connect the texture to the image X input. And by default, triplanar uses the image X input for image Y and Z inputs as well. You can place the triplanar after the ramp node as well. It does not matter. And now if we connect the scalar ramp to our surface output, which is the last node in this chain that we just created, and increase the triplanar scale to 0.03, we get a much better projection. Triplanar basically projects a texture from all the sides. If I hide the floor quickly and connect the scalar ramp output to the reflection roughness input, which as you remember controls refraction roughness as well, and use the material as the output shader, now we can see this frosty floral pattern. And if I wanted to make it less frosty, I just have to make the white values of my texture darker using the scalar ramp. So I'm going to grab the second point, which controls the brighter parts of the texture, and decrease its value to around 0.6. Or even lower if you want the pattern to be subtler. For now, let's unhide the floor and disconnect the scalar ramp from the material so we can move on to the rest of the parameters. Probably the most important parameter for a refractive material is IOR, or index of refraction. In the previous lesson, I talked about the IOR value in the reflection section and how it both controls Fresnel reflectivity for reflections and index of refraction for basically refractive objects. You notice the IOR value is grayed out right now because again this link to reflection option is checked by default, and the IOR value in the reflection section controls the IOR value here as well. I suggest just keeping this option enabled and using the IOR value up here to control both Fresnel reflectivity and index of refraction. That's how things works in nature. So IOR controls how much light rays will bend as they enter a medium. This value is 1 for vacuum, so the light won't bend in vacuum, 1.33 for water, 1.52 for household glasses, 2.41 for diamond. You can also find IR values for different transmissive materials on the internet. As we are dealing with glass, let's use something like 1.5. The next parameter I want to talk about is this dispersion Abbe number. To see how this works, let's hide the glass and the bottle and unhide the gem's geometry. Dispersion controls how much the index of refraction varies across wavelengths. At 0, which is a special value, dispersion is turned off. The lower the value, the more dispersion the shader would have. Normally, you would use a value between 10 to 70 to stay in the normal ranges. Let's set it to 5. We get a very, very strong dispersion effect. Let's try 10. Still very, very strong. Maybe 30. Now it's more subtle. And if I set it to something like 70, the effect would be less visible. So as we increase the value, the dispersion will become weaker. The normal range for the Abbe number is between 10 to 70. For diamond, you can use something like 55. For sapphire, around 72. So it's really up to you. We can disable dispersion altogether for now, hide the gems, and unhide the bottle and the glass. Finally, let's quickly see what this thin-walled option does. If you have a very thin transparent surface that does not have any thickness like a pane of glass, you can enable this thin-walled option to save some render time without any considerable visual penalty to your lighting. When thin wall is enabled, refraction rays will enter and immediately exit the medium without bending the rays. It basically simulates a thin glass plane with no refraction and no caustics, and you should use this parameter when you have a single plane or pane as your window geometry. It can make interior renders faster when a glass material with thin option checked is assigned to the window instead of a normal glass, as it's less computationally expensive. So in this lesson, we learned about the refraction section of the Redshift material. We skipped its subsurface section to discuss it in its own lesson. See you in the next video. In this lesson, we take a look at the refraction subsurface or single scattering section of the Redshift material. So create a new Redshift material, assign it to the shader ball, and start IPR. Now let's open up the material and come down to the refraction section and open the subsurface parameters. Using these parameters, you can control what happens to light rays as they travel through a medium. Do they lose a lot of energy or become attenuated? What color the light rays will turn into as they travel farther through the medium? Do they go right through the medium or they will scatter beneath the surface, hence subsurface scattering? You can use these parameters to create shaders for high viscous liquids like honey, caramel, chocolate, jam, or surfaces like ice or opalescent glass. As these parameters describe what happens to light rays when they enter a medium, first we need to tell our shader to allow light rays to enter, which we do that by increasing the refraction weight. Let's set it to 1 for now. Now the light rays will enter through. Depending on our IOR value, which is 1.5 right now, they bend a bit and go out from the other side. Now, if we want these light rays to change color or scatter around before going out, we can come down to the subsurface section. There are two ways to specify this attenuation subsurface scattering effect: transmittance and extinction. For now, let's stick with transmittance. When transmittance color is set to white, it means light rays will pass right through without being absorbed. If I change the color to a reddish color and just increase this absorption scale to something like 0.1, we are telling our material to turn the white light rays to red as they pass through. That is not a technically accurate description. I'm just trying to simplify as much as possible. This absorption scale controls the amount of the absorption effect, with a value of 0 meaning no absorption and larger values meaning stronger absorption and thus denser looking materials. Now, if we want the light rays to also scatter beneath the surface, we can use the scatter scale and scatter coefficient values. If I start increasing the scatter value, the light rays will scatter beneath the surface inside the geometry and we get this muddy, cloudy look. Using this scatter coefficient, we can control which wavelength of the visible light will be scattered more, or basically the color of the scattering. Let's go for a blue color here. And this scatter scale controls the overall amount of scattering. If we don't want any scattering, we can simply zero out the scatter scale value. To get a bit more predictable result, you can use the same color for both transmittance and scatter coefficient. Depending on what you want to create, you might want to use barely or very different colors or just similar colors. I'll show you a few examples at the end of this lesson. If I use a red color with the RGB values of 200, 20, and 20 for both transmittance color and scatter coefficient color, then set the absorption scale to 0.3 and scatter scale to 0.6, we get something very close to a strawberry jam shader. We'll come back to it later on to get it to look better. Also, we have this phase parameter. Phase controls the direction of scattering for a ray. Positive amounts means a ray can only go forward away from the light source inside the object. 0 means a ray can go backward and forward. or isotropic scattering, and negative values means a ray will be scattered backward towards the light source to the outside of the object. Now let's change the attenuation unit to extinction. And let's zero out the scatter scale and change the scatter coefficient color back to white to take a look at this extinction scale and color. Now we can change the extinction coefficient to a red color and start increasing the extinction scale to maybe around 0.4, 0.5. You notice instead of the defined red color, we see its complementary color, this cyan. And extinction scale does the same thing as the absorption scale in the transmittance mode. Then if necessary, we can start adding subsurface scattering using scatter coefficient and scatter scale. In the transmittance mode, when adding subsurface scattering, the shader would start to appear denser, cloudier. That was because our light rays were being attenuated by both absorption and scattering. But in the extinction mode, adding subsurface scattering won't affect the attenuation of the light rays, and it will only increase the intensity of the scattered rays. I normally use transmittance as it is more predictable, but you got another option if you wanted to. Let's create two shaders, a strawberry jam shader and the dragon shader. Let's start with the strawberry jam shader. I'm going to change the mode to transmittance, change the transmission color to a red color with the RGB values of 212, 28, and 28. Absorption scale to 0.3. And use the same color for the scatter coefficient color as well, and change the scatter scale to 0.6. Now I'm just going to add a quick reflection refraction roughness map and a bump map. For the reflection roughness map, add a texture node and load this BW38 blur texture. Connect it to a scalar ramp node before connecting it to the reflection roughness input. In the scalar ramp node, we want to invert the texture and make its values quite darker to get us a sharp reflection and refraction. So I'm going to grab the first point and increase its value to 0.15, select the second point and lower its value to 0.05. And this will add a bit of variation to the reflection and refraction roughness. For the bump mapping, let's add a noise node, just a normal redshift noise. And let's make it the output shader so we can see how the noise looks on the surface. Fractal is good enough for the noise type, but we want the noise to appear smaller on the surface. So let's set the overall scale to 1. Under the coordinates tab, and let's make our material to be the output shader. Now to get this noise map to control our bump mapping, let's add a bump map node and connect the noise node to the texture input of the bump map node. And now connect the output of the bump map node to the bump input of the material. Now we get this aggressive bump mapping. Let's just select the bump map and decrease the bump scale to 0.1. And let's wait a few seconds to see what we get. Cool, that's our jam shader, pretty good. Now let's go to the second scene for this lesson and make our dragon shader. I'm just going to create a new redshift material and assign it to the dragon geometry and start IPR. You can check out the lighting for this lesson on your own. So first, let's open up the material. I'm going to increase the refraction weight to 1. Set the refraction roughness to 0.25. You can add your own reflection roughness, but I'm just gonna use a simple roughness value, change the transmittance color to this light pink, and absorption scale to 0.6. Change the scatter coefficient color to this pale blue and scatter scale to 0.55. Finally, we can increase the phase to 0.6 to add a bit of forward scattering and contrast. And here is our amazing dragon shader. Let's create a few variations with maybe one that has a happier tone. I'm gonna make a copy of our material in the work area and use this new material as the output shader. And for this one, let's simply decrease the scatter scale to around 0.3. Now this is less dark and harsh. And finally, let's create a green version of it with some subtle pink scattering. So let's create another copy and use it as the output shader. For the transmission color, use this pale green. Absorption scale can be left at 0.6. Now use this more saturated pink as the scatter color. And finally change the scatter scale to 0.45. Now let's see what we get. And that is our green dragon shader. So in this lesson, we learned about the refraction subsurface or single scattering section of the Redshift material. See you in the next one. In this lesson, we'll learn about the sheen component of the Redshift material and how to create realistic fabric shaders in Redshift for Cinema 4D using the sheen component. If you take a look at this reference picture, you can start to see what makes fabrics look like fabrics. Look how the faces or polygons that are parallel to our viewing direction are darker and the perpendicular faces to our viewing direction become fuzzier and brighter. If you can simulate this, you can get realistic fabric shaders. And this is exactly what sheen component is supposed to do. It is basically simulating microfibers and cloth-like surfaces or any sort of fuzziness on fruits and other things. Before creating any actual fabric shader, let's take a look at the sheen parameters. So let's create a new Redshift material and assign it to the geometry and also open up its shader graph. For a realistic fabric shader, you only need the diffuse and the sheen component plus any bump, normal, or displacements mapping. So for now, we can zero out the reflection weight and use a dark gray with the RGB value of around 50 for the diffuse color. In the sheen component, let's set the sheen weight to something like 0.5. And the sheen color is set to white by default. We immediately get that fuzziness at glancing angles. You notice how the parallel faces to our viewing direction are showing the defined darker diffuse color and the perpendicular faces are showing the defined white sheen color. In addition to that white color, sheen component also adds that feeling of fuzziness and cloth by simulating microfibers. We have the sheen color that controls the color of the microfibers, and generally this should be a brighter, less saturated version of the diffuse color. For now, let's keep it at white. We also have this sheen roughness, which modulates how much the microfibers diverge from the surface normal direction. Basically, using the roughness value, you can control where that fuzziness begins. By increasing it, it begins at lower angles from the parallel faces, and by decreasing it, the fuzziness starts at higher angles from the parallel faces. If I set the roughness to 0.1, you see how the sheen effect is limited to very extreme glancing angles. And if set to something like 0.6, now that sheen effect is more widespread and starts earlier. And sheen weight controls how much the sheen component contributes to the overall shader. So that's about the sheen component. Now let's make some realistic fabric shaders. First, we try to create a purple velvet shader. So create a new Redshift material. and assign it to the geometry, and also open up its shader graph. Zero out the reflection weight. For the diffuse color, use this dark purple. You notice it doesn't look like fabric at all or velvet because we still don't have that previously described attributes of fabrics. For something like velvet, set the sheen weight to 1 and sheen roughness to 0.2. And for the sheen color, let's use a brighter, less saturated color compared to our diffuse color. And now as you can see, we get this nice velvet shader. Let's go for a blue velvet. I'm gonna just copy the purple velvet shader and assign it to the geometry. To create a blue velvet, you just need to adjust the diffuse color and the sheen color. So let's use this dark blue for the diffuse color and a less saturated, brighter color, a pale blue for the sheen color. And now you have a nice blue velvet shader. If we bring up the reference picture again and zoom in a tad, you notice we have this fabric pattern throughout. So let's add this pattern as well. So I'm going to duplicate the purple velvet shader and assign it to the geometry. Let's add a texture node and load this fabric pattern image. And as we want to use this as the bump map input, which is a data input, let's change its color space to raw as we are in ACES. And now connect it to the texture input of a bump map node. And connect the bump node to the bump input of the Redshift material. I'm going to set the bump height to around 0.2 because we are dealing with velvet and any pattern should be very subtle. Set the texture as the output shader just to see how it sits on the geometry. I'm going to set the tiling of the fabric pattern image to around 0.2 and 0.2. And finally, we can set the Redshift material as the output shader again, and let's see what we get. And now we have this beautiful fabric pattern as well. Now let's create a crushed velvet, something like this picture right here. For this, duplicate the original velvet shader and open up its shader graph. And obviously assign it. Now here we need two base velvet shaders. One should be fairly brighter than the other one. Then we mix the two to get the final crushed velvet look. Let's duplicate the material in the shader graph. Create that brighter version. And now we can use a brighter diffuse and sheen color compared to our base shader. Now add a material blender node and connect it to the surface input of the output shader. Material blender basically allows you to stack up and mix materials. So I'm going to connect the darker velvet shader to the base material base color input and connect the brighter shader to layer 1 layer color 1 input. Now add a texture node and let's load this texture called BW8 and use it as the blend color 1 input. So basically where the texture is white, the second shader will show up, and where the texture is black, the first texture will show up. I'm going to set the tiling for BW8 map 2.2 so it sits better on the geometry, and its color space to raw as it controls the data input. Now we are getting this nice and realistic crushed velvet shader. Next, let's create a simple upholstery cotton fabric shader. So let's create a new Redshift material and assign it. Zero out the reflection weight as we don't need it. Load the fabric pattern image again and set its tiling 2.2 and connect it to the diffuse color. We want to use the same image for the sheen color as well, but we want it to be brighter compared to the diffuse color texture. As we learned, the sheen color needs to be brighter and less saturated. So connect it to a color correct node. And now connect the color correct node to sheen color input of the shader. In the color correct node, let's increase the gamma to 3 so we get a quite brighter version of our original texture. Now in the material itself, set the sheen weight to something like 0.6, set the sheen roughness to something like 0.3, and for the bump map, connect the original fabric pattern texture to a bump map node. Set the bump height to 1 and connect the bump node to the bump input of the Redshift material. And here is our beautiful realistic cotton. While we are here, let's create a colored version of this. Simply duplicate the whole shader and assign it. Now add a color layer node, which allows you to layer up textures and RGBA inputs. Use the fabric pattern image as the base color and use this light reddish brown as the layer 1 color. Now set the second layer blending mode to exclusion and connect the color layer node to the diffuse color input of the material. And simply use the same layer color node as the input for the color correct node that is connected to the sheen color. But we can decrease the gamma to 0.2. For this to look better, let's increase the sheen weight to something like 0.8. So it really depends on what you are looking for. If you want more of that fuzzy feeling, just increase the sheen weight. And let's see what we get. And there you have it. Next, let's go for a satin look. And for this one, we won't be utilizing the sheen component. As for satin, if you take a look at this reference picture, you notice satin or silk is different and the highlights are kind of playing with you. There is no well-defined pattern that you can describe, but I have a pretty good formula to create highly realistic satin or silk shaders, and it involves curves or ramps. So let's create a new Redshift material and assign it. Zero out the reflection weight. For silk, first we need a Fresnel node. So let's load it and connect it to our diffuse color. If I change the facing color to white, perpendicular color to black, disable use index of refraction and correct facing color intensity, and finally set the curve fall off to around 1, Now, this Fresnel node outputs 0 or black for the perpendicular faces to our viewing direction and 1 or white for the parallel faces to our viewing direction. But we want to be able to remap these values